Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and this is our 17th episode. I actually looked it up so I would remember it this time, of Life, the Universe, and Humanistic Judaism, our Rabbis and Cantors series. This is exclusive for members of SHJ affiliated communities or SHJ independent members or donors or supporters, kind of along the lines of that PBS model where most of our content is free for everybody, including this recording will be up on YouTube for everybody, but live participation we reserve as a thank you for our members and supporters. We are a nonprofit organization. We're a congregational denomination. We need your support. And we are appreciative of you for being members and supporting a cause you believe in. And so this is one of a couple of ways that we thank our member supporters, subscribers. So I am happy to invite you to this episode, which I will introduce in a moment, but I just want to give you a calendar note that next month, which will be the last before we break for the summer, is on the second Thursday. We had moved this year to the third Thursday of the month, but next month will be the second Thursday, which is June 12th, with Rabbi Miriam Jarrett. We will, of course, send that out in our emails, but I wanted to let you all know, because if you log in on the third Thursday of June, you will be by yourself. So today I am excited to welcome Rabbi Jeffrey Falick. Here is his brief bio. Rabbi Falick has served as rabbi of the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit, formerly the Birmingham Temple, since 2013. Rabbi Falick became involved in secular humanistic Judaism in 2009 after a lifetime of searching and questioning. His involvement in our movement includes his roles on boards and executive committees of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis and the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Rabbi Falick received his BA from the University of Texas at Austin, which you would never know by looking at his background, and his MA and ordination from the Reform Movement's Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. He previously served as director of Hillel Jewish Student Centers at universities in Illinois and Miami, and at the Jewish Community Center in Miami. As a Jewish educator, Rabbi Falick has served as a faculty member at numerous schools and programs, including the Melton School and several congregational and community-wide youth programs. He's also very active in the secular humanistic world and was recognized for his intra-humanistic organizational efforts with the 2018 Freethinker of the Year Award by the Center for Inquiry, Michigan. Welcome, Rabbi Falick. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So we are going to talk today about the history of Jews, primarily in the United States, although I think a lot of what I'll discuss today will be things that filtered over into Canada as I look at my colleague, Rabbi Goldfinger. But we're really going to be focusing on on America. So this is a very, very short summary of a class I began teaching last October. I'm not a historian. I'm a student of American Jewish history, but I think a pretty interested one, a pretty active one. And that class, you can actually find it on our website. On our YouTube page, which is accessible through our website. Called The American Jewish Experience. It's available for anybody now to watch. We're only up to the 1850s, maybe kind of bleeding into the 60s and 70s. We had and I'll share some pictures from it, a retreat, a visit to Cincinnati a week and a half ago. Our congregation took, and not all of them, of course, and a few, many of whom are in that class with me. Some of you online are as well, some of you even from a distance. And we had an opportunity to see some very important places in American Jewish history that I'm going to be talking about. But before we get to those places, which were established in the mid to late 19th century, we're going to go all the way back to the 17th century. Talk about the arrival. This was my very first lesson that I gave, and you'll hear more about it in detail if you'd like to check those videos out. You can listen to them as podcasts as well. All right, the advertisement now being completed. So when did the first Jews get here, and who were they? Our community in the United States, in America, North America goes back to 1654. It was in 1654 that 23 Jews escaping from the community of Recife, Brazil, which, having been part of the Dutch world, now had switched over to the Portuguese world and was no longer a very friendly space for the Jews to live in. And so they began to disperse in that community wherever they could. And one small boat brought over 23 Jews. They were mostly women and children. There were a few men there as well. And they came to where Paul is, kind of, a little bit across the river, but which was then, of course, as we all know, called New Amsterdam. And New Amsterdam was not particularly welcoming to begin with, but that would become something of a pattern in American Jewish life, but also the results were something of a pattern as well. Peter Stuyvesant, as you may know, was the governor under the Dutch West India Company, and he very, very much objected to the arrival of these Jews. He feared that they would be a burden. He also feared their religious proclivities and so forth. And he lobbied very hard with the Dutch West India Company to exclude Jews, but to no avail. The Jews had some amount of influence in Amsterdam, and especially shareholders there. And others had simply financial concerns about restricting new people from coming to the colony that needed its population to be maintained. And so they said to him, well, you know, maybe we'd rather not have them, but after many deliberations, we've decided and resolved that the Jews may travel and trade in New Netherland, which was their name for the entire colony, and live there on the condition that the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or the community. And that's how it all started. And slowly but surely, the Jews began to assert themselves. Now, keep in mind, throughout this entire talk, we're going to be talking about very, very minute numbers. The point isn't to tell you the whole experience of this wonderful grand Jewish community. It's to show you how we got started and why the things that happened here were very, very important and quite unlike anything that Jews had experienced anywhere else. Already in the 1650s, the Jews were beginning to assert their equal rights. And there were ways to do this, but it really didn't begin to take off for the Jews as a place, a desirable place to live, until the 1660s. You know, it's not called New Amsterdam anymore, and that's because it was renamed when the British took over, and that was in 1664. And that was when some Jews began to arrive, also from Britain, and a few more Jews from the Dutch islands, from the Netherlands themselves. And this tolerance that was there for the Brits in many ways that they had been developing for quite some time was extended to the Jews. Now, when the Jews came, and this is really significant, the organization of the community is something that's always fascinated me. So, you know, back in Europe, there was really no space for anything that wasn't the synagogue, writ large the community. It's called the synagogue kahila model, kahila meaning community in Hebrew. This idea that the synagogue and the kahila, the community, are one. And that's something that's, I think, very, very difficult for us as modern people, and certainly as modern American Jews, to understand. But it was very, very common in Europe. There simply was no space. And in fact, a lot of that was externally imposed, because in most of the European capitals and cities where Jews lived, the religion was controlled by the government, even the Protestants. And it was something actually that in England they were struggling with quite a great deal. And in fact, some of the toleration that was put in place for the quickly evolving Protestant sects, the smaller ones, which absolutely thrived here, and honestly, which gave rise to many settlements from those people seeing themselves persecuted back home in England. Well, that kind of tolerance that was extended to the Jews, and it meant that the Jews were going to, in the future, have to reconsider what kind of model we had. But for a long time, it was the synagogue kahila model. It took a while, but finally, in the early mid 18th century, The Jews even got citizenship here. And that was really a result of what was going on in England with the extension of tolerance, as they called it, to these smaller Protestant sects, not to the Catholics. They weren't going to enjoy that. That's a whole different story. I spent a lot of time in the class just explaining what the heck was going on in England because it was so important to us. Now, this synagogue kahila model, as kind of constricting and really frustrating as it might have seemed to people, and increasingly it was, it spread to other communities that began to form here. One of the, well, many actually, several of the largest and most significant early Jewish communities are not anymore. The big exception being New York. New York will always be the largest. It has not changed, not one time in our history here, and it will always be a kind of central area for attracting everything. It still is, even to this day, sucking off Jewish population, as does the West Coast as well, from Midwest Jewish cities and other Jewish cities of the interior. But Newport, Rhode Island, became quite a significant Jewish community, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a little while. Savannah, Georgia, its warm port being so attractive and its economy growing as a result, and of course slavery had something to do with that. Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia, which has its own interesting story. Those of you who know American history know that I'm going to be skipping a whole lot of stuff because, excuse me, we're only going to talk about the things that really affected the Jews quite a bit, and not even all of those things. But you can't skip over the American Revolution. American Revolution had an enormous impact on the community here, and the Jews were on both sides. But interestingly, most of the Jews decided to throw their lot with, as they called them, the Patriots. And this was a way sort of developing a strategy of civic integration. The entire Jewish population, all of this congregation, is called Shereth Israel, by the way, and it still exists. It's still a Sephardic, Portuguese, Spanish synagogue. And it was the first and the only one for many, many years. The entire synagogue was evacuated by its leader, a man named Gershom Mendes Sesas, to Philadelphia. And they spent the war there, as of course many other patriots did, because the city of New York was taken over very, very quickly by the British and occupied then. Well, they got through the war and they suffered many of the same damages that everyone else did, and there was an enormous amount of economic displacement. Philadelphia, which had grown to an enormous size because so many Jews were evacuating there, as well as other people. The Jews weren't responsible for the ballooning of anyone's population. We're still talking about hundreds and perhaps the low thousands of Jews, depending on the city that I'm mentioning. But they began to leave. They went back where they were from. They began to scatter around the country, and Philadelphia kind of crashed. Charleston, South Carolina experienced a big crash. They almost never really recovered from it. And so some of these cities that were intensely Jewish, Newport too, began to fall off the Jewish map, but they were still there for a while. And as the Republic began to develop, Newport has a very special kind of story here. So if this was more interactive, I would ask you, how many of you have seen that wonderful United States postage stamp that's got the Touro Synagogue on it? It's still highly collectible. I don't even know if they make it anymore. I don't suppose they do, but a lot of people hoarded them because they were beautiful. That synagogue, though it was actually not the first, not even the second, I think it was the third synagogue to reach out to the new president. This was a thing that the President George Washington, of course, hopefully I don't have to repeat all these famous names to you a lot. He went on a sort of a tour of the colonies. This was like what the kings would do in England. When a new king was crowned, they would go on a tour of the whole country. Well, George Washington did it too, and many people sent him letters, and they had audiences with him. Newport, for a variety of reasons, was one of the last places he went, and even though some other Jewish communities had done this before, and he had said the same thing to them, it was their letter that became famous. And I still get a little excited and a little bit chills when I hear what he had to say. He speaks at length in all of these letters about his admiration for the children of Abraham, the Jews, And then at the very end says these, I think, very iconic words. He says, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." And that is something I think that helped to set the tone. Now, this applied to the federal government. There were plenty of restrictions still in place in state government. Freedom of religion was not entirely noted in every single state government. Some, and you might be surprised which ones, because later we associate them with repression for different reasons, but South Carolina and Virginia were very, very strong places of freedom for Jews and others religiously. They didn't have to abide by that constitutional phrase that there wouldn't be any requirement for any kind of oaths about religion and so forth. But that was, at the time, the federal constitution was not extended in every way to the states. So we saw states like Maryland, which will later have an enormous Jewish population. I spent a lot of time there. My kids are there. That was one of the most repressive. But by and large, the country was headed on the right path. Now, it took something like 35 years or so before the rest of the world felt comfortable coming to the United States. Immigration was very, very slow until about the 1820s. But in the 1820s, a little bit before, but mostly in the 1820s and then in the 1840s and beyond, we see large numbers of immigrants arriving here from Europe primarily. Ireland, number one, Scotland and England, I think number 2 or 3. The Germans, though, I think the Germans were really number 2. Germans came here in vast numbers, and among those Germans were Jews, and a few what we would call today Polish Jews. These were Jews from the eastern part of the Germanies. Remember, Germany was not one unified country yet. It was getting a little closer with every passing decade, but it was not unified. So some who came from Prussia and that general area, who we would today call Polish Jews, some of them came, but a lot of them from Bohemia, today's Czechoslovakia, from Bavaria, from other points on the western side of Germany and the central side of Germany, the central part of Germany as well. Now, again, we're talking about in the low thousands, but these are the people who are going to make this community what it is. And why did they come here? They came here for a number of reasons. Most people came here because they needed economic opportunity. I mean, you can certainly understand that was the position in Ireland, if you know a little bit about what was happening there. Also political oppression for them. The Jews were coming also for economic opportunity, but there was oppression even in Germany, which we generally regard as not the most problematic country at that time in history. Later, of course, that's a different story. But it was a result of many places in the particularly rural areas of Germany, that had, in very complicated ways that I can't go into here, had figured out ways to restrict Jewish growth, and so Jewish individuals began to seek freedom elsewhere. Some in the Netherlands, some in England, but mostly the United States, which was wide open and wanted people. This became a very attractive place. And they didn't come over the way they would later in the 1880s when most of our families did. They came over primarily as individuals. There were small family units occasionally, and it was a hard journey. It was a very hard journey. So a lot of single men came over and maybe sent over later for others and maybe didn't. And they didn't find here, the kind of country that we found in the 1880s and onward when the 2 million came over. What they found here was a completely open area that they could go anywhere they wanted. And what did they choose to do? Well, because it required very little startup capital, because they didn't have opportunity for land ownership, and because they were trying to get into the economy really quickly, they became peddlers. And many of them headed off into the interior. And this is where our communities that we see today in the Midwest and the upper Midwest and in the South came from. A lot of these communities are gone, but many places which today are small, continue to be small, were not any smaller in those days than, say, Pittsburgh, which was one of the early landing places for some of these folks. All kinds of rural farming communities which became small towns. Cincinnati, up here in Detroit, Cleveland, down in Memphis. That one was a little bit later. But through the 1820s, 30s, and by 1840, we see Jews in all of these kinds of places, and they're spread out, and they're lonely, and they don't have access to a Jewish community. When they get a minyan, the first thing they do is put a Jewish community together. But eventually, some of them make some money. Some of them make a lot of money. Some of them don't do as well at all. And these names of those folks who made the money, well, you know a lot of those names. They eventually will end up on iconic retailers' walls and financiers and everything from the steel industry later on to coal mining to banking, you name it. And if I had the time, I would give you some of these biographies, but that's why I wanted to mention the class, because one of the things I like to do there is just stop and talk about some people. I am going to talk about a few people. A lot of what made this westward expansion possible too, there had to be people to peddle to begin with, was something called the market revolution. It's not the same as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is a worldwide phenomenon, and certainly the United States partook in that, and it was a big part of our history too. But this was sort of a sub phenomenon. The market revolution had to do with the development of trade corridors, rivers, an emerging railroad, although that took a while, the Erie Canal, which opened up the Great Lakes. And with that emergence came a whole different kind of economy. We had subsistence farmers who had come out here to the first place. If you wanted something, you got it locally. There was no manufacturing. And now there's manufacturing, and it's happening out east. It's happening in the center of the country, and people are getting goods all over the places, and that's going to attract services, and that's going to attract peddlers who are going to sell those goods to the rural areas, and on we go. And the next thing you know, we're a whole bunch of capitalists with a whole bunch of competition. And that's going to change the face of American Judaism, probably in the most important way. So I told you about this Kehillah synagogue kind of model. Well, in the class, I get into some of what the implications of that were. How at first, in order to grant access to the Jews or give them access to the things they needed, decreasingly, but at the beginning, kosher food, but high holiday services, just like we want them. A place to be buried, just like we need, maybe not today with us so much, but the kinds of things that you have to have if you're a Jew. And to get those things, you have to be part of this community. But as Jews are moving further away, and Paul's sitting in Brooklyn, that's further away. That's not an easy trip to Lower Manhattan in the 1800s, certainly not in the early 1800s. I mean, there's not a bridge. And there's horses and chariots, and to get carriages and to get down there, it's a job of work, and that's a very close by place. And then you think about a farmer who's 50 miles, 60, 80, 100 miles away. That's not a car trip. That's several days travel. And Jews are out in this place as well. So this Kehillah model starts to fall apart on that basis, but it falls apart on other bases too. Jews start to figure out that we are, as a Jewish community, we are maybe not so happy with this model because it's, for instance, completely Sephardic, and we're all from Germany. And the ones who aren't from Germany, we're from parts of Germany that are basically Poland, and even Poland. There were Jews who weren't that far from Germany who came over. That wasn't the big rush we're going to see later on, but it's enough people. And they start making their way over here, and now they're the majority. And they start setting up competing synagogues, competing minyans in the places where they can do it. Now, it's not that easy everywhere because you don't have the number of Jews, but it becomes quite popular in places like New York, in Philadelphia, which does begin to recover, in Charleston. And at first, this pluralism we have is, I want to do a service and have rituals and have my Judaism that looks like it did in Frankfurt or Berlin or wherever, or in what they call today Danzig. I want it to look like that and not how it looks in Spain or Portugal or in the Netherlands where so many Sephardic Jews live. And that was the competition. Another problem, of course, was that even with this kind of intense interest in doing their own thing and, founding their own synagogues, the sparseness of the population continued to be a problem, even in bigger cities. Because bigger cities didn't really mean a lot. We're talking about cities of 10, 20,000 people, with the best of them having 500, 600 Jews. And so what are you going to do then as people begin to intermarry? And worse for the leadership, they begin to simply drop observance. And not because they don't want to do it. We read a letter from a peddler who just lamented that he couldn't observe Shabbat the way he wanted to. And remember, we're not talking about using electricity and driving a car and watching TV. We're talking about people who have to work on Shabbat, who, in order to eat, have to work on Shabbat. The weekend is not going to be Saturday, Sunday for a really long time. And if there's a day off that Americans take, and a lot of them do, it's Sunday. In many places that was enforced. We still have blue laws. I think there's some blue laws near New York, right? New Jersey has a few left still. Still places you can't buy alcohol before noon, I suppose. So as the community begins to develop, and the leadership is very much in the East, and there are some strong pockets of community developing in, like I said, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, notably both of those, Chicago too, although it doesn't take a central role for quite a while. The Jewish intelligentsia begins to ask the question, what are we going to do about this? So there are basically three things that come up. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about each individual and share some stories with you in the time I have left. One of them is something called traditional revivalism. We want to bring more meaning, more joy, more participation into traditional Judaism, make it more attractive. I'll tell you how they did it in a minute, and it might seem strange to you. Another one had similar goals, but also felt that if we really wanted to attract Jews, it needed to be modern. It needed to be in the American spirit. It needed to not only have participation, it needed to revise the liturgy completely. It needed to revise practice and expectations. It needed to address belief. Both of these groups, one of which grew into what we call modern Orthodoxy. There was no ultra-Orthodoxy here at the time, and there would not be for a long, long time. And the other of which became Reform Judaism, which will include conservative Judaism. If you ever wonder why they had that dumb name, it's because they were the conservative reformers, and it kind of stuck. And ultimately, but not until the mid-20th century, our own movement. And then there was this whole other group of people. I call it the B'nai B'rith model. I got that from Jonathan Sarna, great historian I depend upon for a lot of this, a man I studied with. The B'nai B'rith model was the idea, hey, let's have a community that's founded on secular stuff. Now, they didn't use that word, but things that weren't about religion. They were about peoplehood and connections, fraternal organization. And so the B'nai B'rith model becomes popular, and it actually is very attractive to everybody. So let me tell you about a few different characters and some debates that took place, and then we can have some Q&A after that. So the first guy I want to talk about is somebody that I have been sadly educated most people have never heard of, and he's probably, I like to call him the father of American Judaism. His name was Isaac Leeser. He is often today referred to as Rabbi Isaac Leeser, but he was not a rabbi. And in fact, there were no rabbis in this country, and don't get any wild ideas here, but there were no rabbis in this country until 1840. The first professional rabbi comes in 1840. Nonetheless, Isaac Leeser established the American Jewish clergy. He kind of invented, although there were those who came before him who were doing this, but he kind of professionalized what we came to call I guess what you'd say, the Chazan minister paradigm. For a long time, we had a Chazan as a cantor, but not a cantor the way we think of it today. It was a person who just did everything in the synagogue. And the first professional one, actually, and he was only quasi-professional, was the man I mentioned earlier, Sesas, and I think his kids, even for a little while, his wife was kind of doing it at the synagogue there in Cherith, Israel, in New York. But this position becomes more professionalized as a result of this man. So who was this guy? Well, Isaac Leeser came over from Germany when he was 17 years old, which is why, of course, he didn't have any formal rabbinical training to the extent that existed, and it did in Germany. You could either get it traditionally through studying at yeshivas and having different rabbis granting you ordination, or there were a couple, not as early as him, but it was beginning, a couple of places in Germany where there were sort of what we would call a modern seminary that were curricularized. But he comes over at 17. He doesn't have any of this, but he's got a really good traditional Jewish education as a child and young person. And in 1824, he's the only guy who knows anything. Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia asks him to be their chazan. And so he takes on this position, and he begins to effect reforms that most people, when I tell them what these reforms are, believe that this cannot possibly be reform. But it was reform. What it was not was Jewish reform of Jewish practice. That it was not. It didn't change halacha. There was no leniency with regard to kashrut, keeping kosher. There were no changes in who could be in a minyan or this or that. This was all done within the Jewish legal framework. But nevertheless, it was very important. And it affects us again to this day that he did this. Part of his revitalization, his regeneration of traditional Judaism was a result of wanting to make it, as I said, more accessible. And how do you do this? You have to give people education. And they're not coming to nighttime adult education classes. They're going to get this through sermons. Now, today we think a sermon, that's what a rabbi does, right? But that's not what rabbis did. A rabbi might give a Devar Torah, a little drash, as they call it, a little word of Torah, a blot, a little, a vort rather, a vort of a word of telling you something. But that was also very uncommon. That didn't happen on a regular basis. He was talking about what the Gentiles were doing. He was talking about what the Protestants were doing. You want to teach people their religion? You get up on the pulpit, on the bima, and you teach them their religion. And you talk about it in English or in German. German, as the German population grows, a lot of this will happen in German. You give them translations of the prayer book. I know this sounds like what a great idea. What do you mean they didn't have them? No, they didn't have prayer books that had translations. They did not have a Bible that had translations. Okay, yes, they had them King James in the King James version of the Bible, but that's a very Christological interpretation of the Torah and of the rest of the books of the Bible. And, it's got that New Testament appended. Books are named wrong. And he translates much of the Bible into English. And while it's not any kind of official translation, it becomes the basis for later more committee-driven translations. He actually starts something called the Jewish Publication Society that goes under, but nevertheless, it becomes the inspiration for the one that just published our book. That happens a little bit later. So this idea of sermons and so forth also means introducing decorum into the service, even a choir. Now, it's an all-male choir, don't get me wrong, but it is choral singing and this by the way, this is found in lots of Orthodox places today. Decreasing number, but if you've ever been to the Central Synagogue in Jerusalem, that's they have a chorus there. It's magnificent the way they do these songs. He founds a newspaper called The Occident in 1843. It's the first American Jewish periodical, and it connects Jews all over the place. One of the reasons we know that there were Jews living where they were living in the interior is because they were subscribing to these papers, and we have the records. The American Jewish Archives holds these, as do other places, the records of their subscriptions. And we can see the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people throughout the country who are receiving these. And he republishes his sermons there and other kinds of things too. He invents, together with Rebecca Gratz, who was this amazing woman also in Philadelphia, just so much to say about her, and I apologize for not saying it today because it's unfair to all her accomplishments, but I highly, if you've ever read Ivanhoe, she was the inspiration for the Rebecca character, because her reputation spread from Washington Irving to England. She knew all of these wonderful people anyway. She comes up with the idea of a supplementary school on Sundays when, the Christians are in church. Let's bring the Jewish kids into our synagogues. And it's Isaac Leeser who helps that idea spread across the country. He does attempt to even found, and he does this in the early 1860s, mid 1860s, a rabbinical college in Philadelphia. It fails. There just aren't enough Jews here who are ready for it yet. But he's an amazing individual, and while he was not a rabbi, he should be remembered for this. He also has a great feeling to bring all the Jews together, but the Jews are going to refuse to come together. And it's not just because they're all busy doing their own thing elsewhere. It's because some of them have gotten this wild idea in their head that his reforms notwithstanding, we need to do something more. And this begins to percolate at first in surprising places, South Carolina in the 1840s, already, by the way, on a steep decline, but strong enough that its congregation, Beth Elohim, has raised enough money to build a new synagogue, a new congregation there. And they're talking about what they're going to do. And one little group of them says, we're not building this if there's no organ. And the other group of them says, that's not what Jews do. And the people who are advocating the organ say, well, we used to do it. We did it in the temple. It's not forbidden on Shabbat by the Torah. It is forbidden by rabbinical law for a number of reasons I can't get into, but that's why it was forbidden. And the traditionalists, of course, objected on all the bases of these kinds of things. They also didn't want their services to look so Protestant. That was behind it as well. But the reform-minded people who, like Leeser, wanted a dignified and decorous service, also wanted music and, gasp, a liturgy that was going to match modern times and modern ideas. A liturgy that was going to stop praying for the return to Jerusalem and was going to focus instead on America as their rabbi, who will come along, and he arrives as a traditionalist and then becomes a bit of a reformer, and then a little bit more than a bit of a reformer, says, America is our Zion, Washington is our Jerusalem. Do not mistake this with current tensions about Zionism and non-Zion. Okay, this was a highly patriotic American kind of thing. This is where we are accepted. It's the only place in the world. I know we don't like to hear about American exceptionalism anymore, but I believe in it, and this is where it was happening. So what goes on here is that they have a lawsuit. It's called Anchor versus Kal Kadosh Beth Elohim. And the summary of the case is this. The traditionalists are saying that by installing this organ, and it has to be built into the temple, by the way. That's why this is coming up during the architectural planning. You got to build it in. You don't go to the mall and buy a Hammond. It's not how it works. That this violates the charter of the congregation. This isn't what we're supposed to be doing, et cetera, et cetera. And they go before the judge, and they have this big civil case there in South Carolina. And you know what the judge says? The judge says this: it does not belong to the civil magistrate to enter into the question of what constitutes the true customs of a church or synagogue. And that, my friends, is the end of any government interference. And you have to understand what a groundbreaking moment this was in the United States. Back in Europe, where reform and reform-minded kinds of people began to express themselves and try to found synagogues, the government very much interfered. And in fact, a lot of those rabbis who came over in the 1840s and 50s were radical reformers who just could not launch. They would try to do little things inside the synagogues. The government would clamp down. Why? They wanted stability. The Jews they know are the Jews they're going to approve of. And so there's not going to be any government neutrality. There's never going to be any government neutrality there until well into the 20th century. In England, there's a little bit more neutrality, but not a ton. They still have a chief rabbi, and he ain't the reform guy. In any case, this really led to this revolution for Jews in this country. It led to religious pluralism, not just We're going to have the Ashkenazim from Germany here and the Sephardim from, whose ancestry goes back to Portugal and Spain there. This is going to be real pluralism. Now, this didn't stop American Jews from wanting to feel united, but it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. And so soon we see these radical reformers, these strong reformers, beginning to found synagogues or to take traditional synagogues into a reform direction. It happens in Pittsburgh. It happens in Cincinnati, notably. Har Sinai, Mount Sinai congregation in Baltimore, is one of the first to do it in 1853. I'm sorry, in 1840 something, I wrote the number down. And then we get the very first synagogue founded as a Reform temple. That's the one that's in Baltimore in 1853, Oheb Shalom, which sadly, though their building is still there, was built a little bit later, recently merged with another congregation right before COVID. That legacy kind of got merged into that. So the next character I want to talk about is a guy named Isaac Mayer Wise. So Isaac Mayer Wise comes over here in 1846, and he's a rabbi, kinda. He didn't go to a rabbinical seminary, but he had private ordination. He's a little bit of a traditionalist, and he tries to join hands with Leeser, who's still working on all of these things, and he supports some of Leeser's work and so forth. But he doesn't stay in Leeser's territory. He's brought over mostly to go up to Albany. And in Albany, they have a strong little Jewish community there, and he begins to really advocate for some moderate reforms. Nothing big at first, but they don't like it. They don't like it at all. Now, the story goes that he and the president of the synagogue got into a fist fight on Rosh Hashanah. This was a very bad idea, as Rabbi Neil Hirsch mentioned on our tour in Cincinnati. It's a very bad idea because they didn't have anybody left to do Yom Kippur then. But he leaves shortly after, Isaac Mayer Wise, and he winds up going to Cincinnati, which is a much more friendly community for him. As he makes his way through professional life, he tries to kind of walk a tightrope. He writes a prayer book, by the way, in English and Hebrew, and in German and Hebrew, because in Cincinnati, it's going to be in German, because that's the vernacular there, called Minhag America. You can see a copy of it in the Smithsonian, The Custom of America. And it's a little bit traditional and a little bit not. Kind of looks like a conservative prayer book today. But, he's a moderate reformer. But nevertheless, he wants reform. He founds a competing magazine called The Israelite, and then ultimately The American Israelite there. Some of my congregants, we saw one of the first editions, a replica of it in the temple there. And today, though, you can pick up a copy of The American Israelite. It's the local Jewish news for Cincinnati, but it was a powerhouse. And it was very much of a competitor with The Occident by Isaac Leeser. And then he begins to set into motion a growth plan. And the growth plan goes everywhere. First, his own temple. They raise the money before 1860, and then it's put on hold because of the war. There was a lot of disruption in Cincinnati. As you know, it was a border state, although Kentucky was not in the Confederacy for very long. They put it on hold, and then as soon as the war ends, they build this magnificent place that I'm going to show you a picture of. This Maronite Muslim-inspired temple. Has to do with the Enlightenment, the Golden Age of Spain, and the mythologization of that. And then he begins to found certain organizations. One of them is the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Now, understand the word Hebrew and Israelite too are complete synonyms for Jew. They're kind of more respectable ways, at least in German it sounds that way for sure, of saying the word Jew. So this was like a Union of American Jewish Congregations. Why? Because he was going to use this union to found a seminary. And indeed, the Hebrew Union founded a seminary. It's called the Hebrew Union College. I was ordained there, and so was Rabbi Wein. It's very, very much a place that gave birth to humanistic Judaism as well. Also many thinkers who did not necessarily become part of our movement. Alvin Reines of blessed memory, somebody I was very fond of. I kind of want to stop there. This is now getting into the 1870s, and then and I want to share a few pictures for you. So I can't believe I did that in the time allotted. that's kind of a little bit of a miracle. Can y'all can see this, right? Okay, so of course it started on the wrong on the wrong on the wrong slide. So let me get to the right one. All right, so let's start with the man himself. This is a picture that the American Jewish Archives found. This is a very large picture, a life-sized almost picture that they have in the Skirball Museum at the Hebrew Union College, and it is magnificent. I have never seen a picture of Isaac Mayer Wise like this before, but this is what he looked like in his heyday. You know, this is a man who knew how to avoid the comb over by growing the bushiness here and here, and just I think a good-looking guy. But this is Isaac Mayer Wise. This was his official portrait at the Hebrew Union College, apparently for some time. This is the Plum Street Temple in downtown Cincinnati. So when I say Maronite, there it is. There's only 3 or 4 of these left in the world, one in Budapest. They didn't copy each other, and this is the oldest. This one's older than that one. We learned that too when we were there. I did not know that. It was originally the brick was painted white for some reason. It stands on a very important intersection where catty corner to it is the Cincinnati City Hall, still there, same one. The large Protestant church is to its side. There was another church that's now gone. It's a garage now, and then the large Catholic cathedral is there. And this was the Jews' way of saying, "We are here. We are America too." And it's just an amazing location. This is what it looks like inside. This is a stock picture. This is where I was ordained. This is where I got my master's degree. This is where also where it happened with Sherwin too. And just a magnificent place, so beautiful. We used to count those light bulbs when we got bored to see which ones were out, how many we could find that were out. Now they're never out because they're LEDs. So, and now those of course were added later. This is the organ in the back, and I really wanted you to see this picture because it illustrates just how important it is. It was to them that it had to be built in. This is part of the structure. And so this is a statement of their desire to reform Judaism in this way. This is the ceiling there above it. Beautiful, beautiful. And this is their ark. And there's just a few features. You could see, by the way, in the organ, you could see replicated. I don't know if you can see my mouse. You can see replicated the outside of the temple here. And here you can see in the front here, you've got a replica of the temple here in the ark. You've got another replica of it here. It's just magnificent, very beautiful. Rabbi Hirsch was so gracious to give us this tour. Very active place. They still are there almost every week. A lot of people asked about this because, you know, today this looks very weird in a synagogue, but this doesn't look weird if you look at the back of a dollar bill or a lot of other American iconography, because this is a United States star. This is an American star, and it's over both sets of seats. The lectern there was exactly the one. Now, this is the Hebrew Union College classroom building. It's a rather large campus, and I fear it is not long for this world. They just purchased a building in New York. They sold their Greenwich Village campus, built that looks a little bit like this, but is 4,000 times larger, and appears to be a place that they will not admit at all may be the future of the Hebrew Union College, because Cincinnati ceased its rabbinical program in 2022. The last group will be ordained next year, and that's it. And their graduate program is done. And it's really hard to maintain a college, even one with a beautiful campus, that has no students. And a very, very greedy hospital next door that has already rented all the space, including this precious space to me. This is a very, very important place to me, and I get a little choked up. I should mention that when this opened, and this is not the original campus, Plum Street Temple. Well, there was a little place before Plum Street Temple, but this is really the original, this is really the third campus. When it opened, it was, as I said, a Hebrew union, the Jewish union. All the Jews would come there, and a lot of other people came. But they learned on the occasion of the first ordination banquet. So it was founded in 1875. This is roughly 7-8 years later. You could get an undergraduate degree over at the University of Cincinnati right next door at the same time. They learned that this may be a little bit more of a radical reform place than they thought, and I'm exaggerating, at what's called the Treifa banquet. We used to give out menus on that every one. And by the time we were doing it, they were kosher banquets. The Treifa banquet, though, was not the breaking point with the moderate reformers. It was just the symbolic end. It was sort of the FU of the people who were on that side of things to say, you know what? Go back to New York. We don't need you, or wherever you're going to go. And they did go to New York, and they founded the Jewish Theological Seminary. And here's a little footnote. Later, when that place went down the toilet, it was Reform Jews from the Upper East Side who funded its reorganization. But that's the story of the 1880s immigration that I won't go into. Wanted people to see the inside of the chapel, and there's a good example of the love of America that it's devoted here. This specifically to the World War II era chaplains. These windows were put in later. And this is our whole group here in front of the Ark that was brought over in 1922. On the very left there, that's where we used to have the lectern, and we all gave our student sermons there, and that's where Sherwin gave his student sermon too. Sadly, it is not in use anymore except for rentals for any little minion that needs it. It is the only part of this building that has not been rented out. It was more than a chapel to us. It was a gathering place. It was a place where we explored ideas every day. I was the chairperson of that room for 1 year, and we did everything in there. It was our only gathering room. In my memory, it was like a child. In my memory, it loomed so large that I remembered it bigger, which is usually not something adults do. But that's the way it looms in the history of reform, and that includes the history of our movement. Many a discussion about humanism was held there. And in fact, the 1970s Union Gates of Prayer included a non-theistic service, at least in the English, that Alvin Reines had put in there. The story of how we became a movement and split and all of that, that's for a different century. Okay, I got this in. I'm sorry it took me so long, but I did the best I could, and I'll stop my share, and I don't know how this works from here because I haven't done this in over a year. So,
well, first of all, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I love this stuff. I love the history of it. It gave me some ideas. I think this fighting on Rosh Hashanah might be a draw for our movement, kind of a combo MMA high holiday thing. And since you mentioned stamps, I couldn't resist but to pull off of my shelf. I have this I hate that. I actually have the stamp, the Toro Synagogue. Oh, you're not going to be able to see it, but I have the stamp. It came out in the Toro Synagogue stamp came out in 1982 for the 250th anniversary of Washington's birth. That's how they commemorated it, and it does have on it that quote: "To bigotry, no sanction; to persecution, no assistance." So those words also give me goosebumps, and I think that there was a split. This is so Jewish. There was a split between that congregation, and I think there was like a 20-year legal battle over who owns the actual letter that Washington wrote, and I don't know whether that was resolved.
And the patrons of that congregation, when it finally kind of died, was the Shereth Israel, the original congregation in New York, and that's the body with whom they've had all these wars in court very recently, very recent.
I know it's just so Jewish, that part of it,
right? Of course.
But anyway, we have like a couple of minutes. If folks have specific questions, you can just come off of mute and ask.
I wasn't tracking the
No, just positive comments. I didn't see any questions in there. I did have one question about citizenship. You mentioned that the Jews eventually got citizenship, but was that while England, like pre-independence?
Oh, very, very much so. That was in the 17th century. You know, the British back in England were having a very, very, and it wasn't about citizenship, it was about other things, but they were having a big problem trying to figure out how they were going to accommodate all these new Protestant sects, many of which were over here by then. And this led to bills of tolerance and toleration that had gone through, and so when those went through, at one point they were finally applied to the Jews. Not voting rights, nothing like that. That didn't happen until the 19th century for the Jew bill. We only had one state that ever, and one actually entity that ever had a Jew bill, and that was Maryland. Other than that, citizenship and voting rights That primarily, remember, voting rights was an issue here anyway, but the colonies organized the voting, and so the Jews in most of those places had the right to vote. But again, we're talking about handfuls of people.
Right. Right. Fascinating.
There were
Any
probably 100,000 Jews here when in 1881, 82, 83, when the millions came over, and they were there for them. You know, that Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that we all talk about with all this immigration stuff, that Hebrew there meant Jewish. It was the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, and it was meant to help those Jews. And look, they had all their prejudices too. They did not like these people. They didn't want them coming to their temples, that's for sure. I had a professor who said that that Temple Emmanuel was so strident in not permitting head coverings in their temple because they didn't want any of these schmutzy Jews from anywhere coming there, even when they got some money in their pockets. I don't believe that, but it does seem a little plausible.
Great.
Anything else? Any other?
All right, here's a question in the
Okay.
chat. Did Washington live what he wrote regarding local Jews?
Yes, he did regarding Jews. I mean,
Right.
you can take it up with American historians about other aspects of it. But yes, he was very good. But keep in mind, nobody knew a lot of Jews. There weren't a lot of Jews to know. But yes, and Jews helped significantly in some cases. Chaim Solomon is one of those examples. Did help to fund the revolution, and also Jews lost a lot of money on it. It was not a profit making thing. He and the handful of Jews who did have the means to do it at that time did not prosper from that war, and most of their debts were not paid back. The United States was very, very poor country for many, many decades.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I will have this up on YouTube in about a week.
Okay, no.
But really appreciate it. And as I mentioned to everyone at the beginning, our next one will be June 12th, which is the second Thursday of June, not the third Thursday. And that will be with Rabbi Miriam Jarris. Thank
And be
you.
sure and check out the classes if you're more interested in this. There's a lot more detail there.
Yes, on the YouTube channel for Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro.
The link is on our website if you don't remember where.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.